Julius Nyerere, father of the nation.
Yeah.
That's the image, isn't it? The one many of us probably have for Tanzania's first president.
It is, yeah. That's the sort of foundational picture.
But, what if there's more to it? Like, what if that's just the first couple of pages?
Well, exactly. And this deep dive, it isn't really about trying to tear down that image entirely.
No.
It's more about adding layers, putting it into a wider context. We're looking at the material we have to explore the, let's say, the tougher parts, the less seen realities of his time in charge.
Right. That's our mission here today.
Yeah.
To kind of navigate beyond that familiar story, independence, unity, all that, and really get into the challenging stuff about Nyerere's leadership. We're using these sources to try and get a fuller picture, maybe a more nuanced one.
Mm-hmm. And to do that, we really need to look closely at the policies he put in place, the actual events that happened, and what the results were, on the ground. Both the intended results and maybe the ones that weren't so expected.
Okay. So, where do we usually start? His early life, right? Born in Butiama, 1922. Seems like a classic story leader, comes from humble beginnings.
It does have that feel. And his education was really important, studying in Uganda and then later over in Britain. That's where he encountered a lot of socialist thinking.
Ah, okay. Ideas that would become pretty central later on for Tanganyika.
Definitely. You see them shaping his vision.
And that vision, it really started coming together with TANU in '54, didn't it? The Tanganyika African National Union. He was obviously a big part of that.
Oh, absolutely central. A really key figure. His leadership in getting people on board, explaining the dream of self-rule, that was just crucial for getting independence from Britain in 1961.
Right. That moment sort of sets everything else in motion.
It really does. It's the launch pad.
Then comes Ujamaa, which on the surface sounds incredibly ambitious. African socialism, creating self-reliant villages, farming together, trying to carve out something unique.
It was ambitious, absolutely. Ujamaa means familyhood in Swahili. The idea was to build on what Nyerere saw as traditional African community values.
Yeah.
Sharing resources, farming collectively.
Yeah.
That was supposed to be the path to self-sufficiency. Different from capitalism, different from Soviet communism.
But because there always seems to be a but.
Well, yeah, the implementation, that's where things got difficult.
Forced villagization.
Yeah.
I mean, that phrase alone sounds like it would cause problems right away. What do our sources say about how that actually went down?
The material we've looked at, it suggests pretty strongly that moving people into these Ujamaa villages, it often wasn't voluntary.
Right.
So you've got communities being uprooted, moved to these new places that often didn't have enough resources. And a lot of accounts mention poor planning for actually farming the land. It just caused huge disruptions to how people had lived and worked for generations, and a lot of resentment, understandably.
So it wasn't just like bad weather or world markets hurting Ujamaa. There were issues inside the government, too. People weren't all on board.
That's what some of the sources point to, yeah. A growing sort of discomfort, maybe in parts of the government, even the military.
About what specifically?
Concerns about power getting too centralized under Ujamaa, and also just the fact that the collective farms, they weren't delivering the economic goods. Food production was struggling. So this internal disagreement, it added another layer of instability that maybe isn't always talked about.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit to something particularly tough. The Zanzibar Revolution in 1964.
Mm-hmm.
This is just a few years after Tanganyika gets independence. And some of the descriptions of the violence, they're quite shocking.
They are. It was a really brutal event. The sources we have point to, estimates vary, but potentially thousands killed, maybe 10, even 20,000.
Wow.
And it seems the Arab and Indian communities there really bore the brunt of that violence. And Nyerere's government's role, specifically their support for the Afro-Shirazi Party, that's a really difficult, contentious part of the story.
And then almost immediately after, Zanzibar and Tanganyika unite to form Tanzania. People often see that as, building a stronger nation. But was it also maybe a way to kind of consolidate control after all that chaos?
Well, forming the United Republic of Tanzania definitely cemented Nyerere's power across both territories, no doubt about that.
Right.
But those tensions from the revolution, the divisions, they didn't just vanish because of the Union. Our sources suggest they really lingered, shaping politics for years. It makes you question the full picture behind that unification, the long-term effects.
And after that, we get the move to a one-party state in 1965. The justification was national unity, right? Stop the country fracturing. But what did it mean for politics on the ground?
If you look at it as part of that trend of consolidating power, making it a one-party state basically got rid of any formal political challenge.
Wiped out the opposition.
Essentially, yes. The stated aim was unity, sure, but the structure itself just didn't leave much room for different views or dissenting voices to be heard officially.
And it went beyond just not having other parties, didn't it? The sources mention secret police, a climate where speaking out was risky.
Yes, that comes through. Surveillance, clamping down on people seen as opponents. It created this atmosphere where criticizing the government openly wasn't something you did lightly. It definitely put a chill on political debate.
And this political control seems to have extended to information, too. Restrictions on newspapers, limits on free speech, shutting down critical voices.
That seems to be the case. Controlling information is, a pretty standard tool for keeping political control. Limiting what the press could report, going after journalists who were critical. It meant the government had a lot more sway over what people heard and thought.
And all this political tightening, the social controls, it seems to happen alongside the economy really struggling in the 70s. Often linked back to those Ujamaa problems we talked about.
Yeah, and what's kind of ironic looking at our sources is that the whole Ujamaa goal was self-reliance. But in practice, it seems to have led to Tanzania becoming more dependent on foreign aid.
How so?
Well, nationalizing industries, which was part of the socialist idea, seems to have scared off private businesses, both local and foreign investors, and that held back economic growth overall.
What about foreign policy? Nyerere was a huge figure in Pan-Africanism, supporting liberation movements everywhere. Did that have economic knock-on effects?
It definitely earned him a lot of respect internationally. His commitment to fighting colonialism was clear. But yeah, the sources indicate it also caused friction, especially with Western countries.
Right.
And that could lead to periods where aid or investment dried up, a kind of economic isolation at times, maybe even pressure.
And then there was the war with Uganda in '78. Idi Amin invades, Tanzania pushes back. That must have cost a fortune, especially when the economy was already shaky.
A huge cost, financially and in human terms, too. Now, many saw getting rid of Amin as absolutely necessary, a just cause, even.
Understandable.
But for Tanzania, it was a massive drain on resources they just didn't have. It definitely made the existing economic problems worse, added to the hardship people were facing.
So fast forward to the 1980s, and we started seeing a change, right? Moving away from strict Ujamaa, bringing in more market-based reforms. That's a big turnaround.
It is. It really shows they had to make some practical changes because the economic situation just wasn't sustainable. And even though Nyerere himself stepped down as president in '85, our sources make it clear his influence didn't just disappear. He remained a major figure for years.
Which brings us to his legacy. It's clearly complicated. You've got the achievement of holding the nation together, which is huge. But then you have these undeniable struggles, the economy, the limits on political freedom. How do you even start to balance those?
Well, looking at the material, it suggests that while Nyerere had this powerful vision, a united, self-reliant Tanzania, a real ideal, the specific policies used to get there had some pretty serious negative outcomes. Like persistent poverty, needing ongoing help from outside, and this history of political control that sits uneasily with that initial hopeful narrative.
So when we look past that famous Father of the Nation title, we find these other stories running alongside it. The economic difficulties, the clampdown on dissent, the whole complex Zanzibar situation. It makes the picture much fuller, but maybe harder to look at.
I think it just underlines how important it is to look at all the evidence, to get beyond the simple stories and really grapple with the complexities, the contradictions. That's true for any major leader, really. Nyerere's ideals were powerful, no question. But understanding his impact means looking honestly at what actually happened as a result of his policies.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How do we evaluate leaders like that, whose legacy has so many different facets, some inspiring, some really troubling? How do you weigh the dream against the reality for the people living through it? Definitely something to keep reflecting on.